The armory should have sounded like it usually did, soft clinks of steel, the hush of oil on cloth voices low out of respect for the work. But this morning, the air felt tilted a few degrees toward mockery, the kind that makes every laugh a little too loud. Sergeant First Class Dylan Brooks rode that edge as if it were a parade float. He leaned one palm on the scarred workbench and let his voice carry. "Honestly, Chief, you sure you wandered into the right building?" Brooks said, pitching his tone for the benefit of the crowd. "We've got shotguns to prep for the competition, not cobwebs to dust by the new admin clerk." A ring of 20-something shooters, lean, green, and high on their own reputations, snickered obediently. The jokes bounced off cinder-block walls and polished concrete, off rows of racked rifles and a glass-fronted cabinet of trophies that had seen better polish and brighter days. It was an elite unit's armory in every way that mattered, except the one you couldn't measure on a checklist: humility. At the edge of the circle stood Chief Warrant Officer 4, Lana Moretti. Her name stitched small and neat above a quiet chest. She looked to the untrained eye like someone's meticulous ant hair pinned back. Uniform pressed crisp hands, small and dry and unadorned. She had stepped into the armory 10 minutes earlier with a nondescript duffel and a canvas tool roll tied at both ends with frayed cord. She had nodded once when Brooks pointed her toward a rack of Benelli shotguns and made a show of handing her a mop with a flourish. She had not smiled or frowned or explained herself. She set the mop aside, unrolled the canvas, and started to work. From a second-story office window, Colonel James Whitaker watched all of it the way men watch weather fronts without blinking. He was a tall, spare man who'd spent a career learning that noise was rarely a reliable indicator of anything. He didn't see a librarian lost in the stacks. He saw the way Moretti's weight sat centered over the arches of her feet, the economy in her steps, the way her head moved like a turret, never fast, never random, always enough. He saw hands that knew steel, how to ask it questions, and how to listen to the answers. He set his coffee down without tasting it. On the floor, Brooks kept the performance going. "Just make yourself useful," he said, tapping the rack with the back of his knuckles as if calling a dog to heel. "Take these Benellis. Basic clean. Can you handle that?" It wasn't a question so much as a way to get one more laugh. He got it, and still, Moretti gave nothing back, not even a ripple in the surface. She reached for the nearest shotgun with both hands, the way a professional does a tool, not like it's precious, but like it's important. She swabbed the bore, detailed the carrier, and the rails checked the springs with a pinch and a feel and a look that measured wear as much as metal. She worked as if she'd been doing it all her life, and for long stretches, it felt as if the armory's noise had bounced off a bubble around her bench and fallen to the floor. If there was a contemptuous smile hidden somewhere behind Brooks's jaw, it died when Specialist Grady skidded across the floor and hit the central workbench with both hands. "Dead trigger," Grady said, breath short. "We've got a dead trigger." The room's sound changed, as it does when playtime turns serious. On the bench lay the unit's jewel, a customized M210 enhanced sniper rifle, a rifle so tuned it would crowd a penny at 500 yards and tell you which year minted the coin. Tomorrow, it would sit on the line for the All-Army Championship with the unit's best shooter behind it. That was the plan. Plans are funny things. "Get your hands off it," Brooks barked, moving in. "You already stripped it once." "I stripped it twice," Grady said. "Sear looks right. Spring tension checks. Trigger's moving without the brake. I don't get it. The shooters closed in like storm clouds. 2 other armorers, good ones the kind every unit would be proud to have, were already in motion, trays out, pins lined up on a white cloth disconnector in one small pile and the rest grouped by function. Brooks started cursing under his breath. You could feel the sweat arrive on his back and creep beneath the plate carrier like a tide. He looked at the clock. 22 hours to go. This was not a problem he could swagger out of. "Clear a lane," he snapped, and parts clinked into bowls and hands reached for brushes and charts. They checked and rechecked the geometry. They swapped out the obvious culprits. They measured creep with a dial gauge and checked hammer engagement with a magnifier made for stamps. Nothing changed. The trigger moved. The hammer didn't fall. The rifle might as well have been a mannequin. On the outer edge of the circle, Moretti finished the last. Benelli snapped her roll closed with a tug and wiped her hands on a square of cloth so stiff with oil it shined. For a long breath, she didn't move. She stood with her hands across the tool roll and looked at the rifle from where she was. It was the look longtime pros have when they walk into a room full of mid-solved puzzles, a tiny tilt of the head, a patient kindness in the eyes as if to say, I know you've tried hard, now let's finish. She walked toward the center bench and the crowd parted for reasons they would never be able to explain. Dylan Brooks tried to stall her with a blade of sarcasm. What he said betraying the tremble in his throat with a laugh. You got a magic wand in that bag? Master Sergeant Moretti didn't answer. She didn't look at him. She set the canvas roll at the corner of the white cloth, untied one end, and folded back a section. The tools nested there weren't new. Their bones had the luster of steel that's been loved and used. She set a small cork block down and rested 2 fingers of her left hand on the rifle's receiver as if checking a pulse. Reset the hammer, she said softly. Grady obliged. She watched the movement of the components with the stillness of a watchmaker. She pressed a thumb against a particular retaining pin and felt for a hint of play. She did it again slower. Then she reached for a pair of short forceps, slipped them into the action with a certainty that made the nearest onlookers hold their breath, and lifted the firing pin with a careful smooth draw as if she knew exactly how fragile it was and exactly where it would try to catch on the way out. Loop, she said without raising her voice. Someone pressed a jeweler's loop into her hand before they realized they'd moved. She angled the firing pin to the light, turned it a few degrees, and then just held it there. There, she said, touching the edge of the pin with the tip of the forceps. Microfracture along the shear plane. You can't see it without magnification. It's absorbing energy before the hammer can drive it. That's where your trigger went into a crack. The room didn't do much for a second. It couldn't. The sentence landed and had to be absorbed. Then the silence changed in the same way a lake changes when you realize the shape in it is a whale and not a rock. Brooks opened his mouth and decided not to let the word that came out stand. He closed it. He looked at the firing pin and then at Moretti and then down at his own hands. They didn't look like hands that could fix a living thing anymore. They looked like strangers' hands. Moretti reached into her canvas roll and took out a small oil paper packet tied with waxed thread. She cut the thread with the edge of another tool and spilled a single spare pin into her palm. It had the barely visible stamp of a particular shop, one most folks only knew by rumor, a letter inside a star. She cradled the new pin in the block, looked once more at the receiver, and slipped the steel home. The action came together in 3 clicks that made a sound like a lock saying, "Welcome back." She didn't perform a flourish. She didn't do a speech. She handed the rifle to Grady and nodded. Function check. The hammer fell clean on the first try. So did the second. So did the third. The bolts cycled like a song sung in tune. Grady's mouth opened around a thank you that he would not remember forming. Around them, the shooters stood in a ring of recalculated truth, the way men stand when they've just learned something important about their own eyes. On the stair, Colonel James Whitaker came down 1 step at a time, the way men do when they're matching their heartbeat to their thinking. He did not look at the rifle, not right away. He looked at Moretti the way he'd looked at her through the glass, directly without dissection, respecting the privacy of her past and the public nature of what had just happened. Then he turned to Brooks with a quiet voice that carried farther than the loudest command. Sergeant First Class Whitaker said, "Access the roster. Pull up Chief Warrant Officer 4, Lana Moretti. Read it." Brooks didn't try to pretend he hadn't heard. He went to the terminal and typed as if it were a confession. Lines of text spilled onto the screen. This is how the unit learned what the colonel had either known or suspected or merely recognized in outline, the spine of a career written in the kinds of nouns that do not raise their voices. Name. Moretti Lana Brooks read, and his timbre dropped until it was almost a whisper. Grade Chief Warrant Officer 4, Assignment History. He swallowed. JSOC Tier 1 Armorer, Special Mission Unit, Master Gunsmith, U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit attached. Primary billet weapons development and sustainment. Awards All Army Marksmanship Champion. He stopped, refocused, 3 times. His stare dragged to the old trophy cabinet and the Bishop trophy mounted high and forgotten. Whitaker didn't look up. He kept his eyes on Moretti until Brooks understood that the man who should move now was him. He climbed a short ladder. He wiped dust from the engraved plate. He read it twice before he said it aloud. L. Moretti, he breathed. Overall champion. Whitaker stepped in front of the workbench. He squared his shoulders and brought his hand up in a slow salute that had no hurry in it whatsoever. It was not the brisk snap of protocol. It was the kind of salute that says, "I know what it costs to be who you are." Lana Moretti returned it with the same economy she'd shown every other human gesture that day. Chief Whitaker said, "Welcome to the armory." He didn't tell the crowd what they had witnessed. He didn't need to. He looked at the failed firing pin still lying on the white cloth and lifted it into a small evidence bag someone produced as if by instinct. He labeled it in his own hand and handed it back to Grady. "Keep that," he said. "There's your syllabus." The armory changed place by place the way a house breathes differently after a window opens. It began the next morning at 0600 when Dylan Brooks walked through the same door he'd swaggered through yesterday, only this time his hands were empty of jokes and full of a clean notepad and a pen. He found Moretti wiping down the bench and checking a torque wrench against a reference block as if she were tuning a violin. He stood in the doorway long enough to measure the moment for what it was, then crossed into it like a man chooses to cross a line. "Chief," he said. The word sounded strange in his mouth, like a name you think you know, but have never said right. "I was wrong. I was unprofessional. I was ignorant. That's mine to own. If you're willing, I'd like to learn." Moretti's face didn't shift into victory. It didn't have to. She lifted the corner of a grease-stained cloth and made a clean square on the bench, as if she were setting a plate for a guest. "Start here," she said. "Respect the tool. Assumptions are rust." That's how the lessons began, not with ritual or ceremony, but with a principle and a place to put your hands. She taught them to read steel like a book, to understand where force wants to go, and how materials answer when you ask too much of them. She showed them how to find their pace and hold it, how to measure with sight, and then with touch, how to hear the story. A mechanism tells when you cycle it with your eyes closed and your breath even. "Look for where the energy disappears," she said. "The missing is as important as the present. If a thing doesn't do what it should, ask where its power went. Steel can keep a lot of secrets, but not that one." She had them slow down until smooth as fast wasn't a patch on a sleeve, but a line running down the forearm to the fingertips. Brooks was the first to adopt a quiet pre-check that spread through the shop without ever being written down: glass gauge, breath touch. No one called cadence. No one needed to. The room began to make a different kind of sound, the soft click of pins, seating the whisper of oiled steel on cloth pencils, scratching notes that had weight to them. Within 2 weeks, their malfunction rates plummeted. The good armorers became excellent. The average shooters became good. The good shooters looked like pros. Inspection write-ups arrived with a sentence the unit hadn't seen before, executed to the standard Moretti set. Nobody knew who started using it. Everyone started expecting it. Whitaker watched the numbers and the faces. He called facilities and asked about the cabinet in the entryway. They took the sagging shelf down and put a clear case in its place, eye level, inescapable. Inside, he had the Bishop trophy polished until the engraved letters caught the thin light and turned it warm. Beside it, he placed a jeweler's loop on a bit of cork and the failed firing pin in that labeled evidence bag. A brass plaque under the glass read, "Competence requires no announcement." You could see visitors read the words and then lift their eyes to the hardware, and in that space between plaque and steel, you could watch minds changing. New arrivals stopped there first. The orientation tour that used to end with a joke in the armory now began with a story. Brooks told it himself, eyes steady rather than theatrical. He told the part where his voice had carried and her silence had held. He told the part where a cough of steel had shown him how to listen. He told the part where the most important thing he'd done was shut up and watch her hands. It never sounded like a confession. It sounded like gratitude. For Lana Moretti, nothing obvious changed. She still came in early and left late. She still rolled her tools rather than snapping cases. She still wrote in small, careful block letters and tied oil paper packets with the same knot each time. If anything, her world got quieter because the people around her began to respect the silence that real work requires. She never told stories of where she'd been or who she'd worked beside. She let steel be her biography and standards be her signature. Every so often, some fragment of the past would float through anyway, usually the kind that landed like a touch on the shoulder and not like a boast. A visiting master sergeant from another unit would see her at the bench and stop in the doorway with a smile that reached his eyes. A receipt from a decade-old match fee would fall out of a dog-eared manual. Someone would mention a defunct machine shop by first name and Moretti would answer with a part number. The younger hands learned to pay attention in those moments the way you pay attention when you pass a lighthouse at night and understand how it was placed. The next big competition told its own story. The M210 ran like a metronome set to heartbeat. The unit's top shooter came off the line at the end of the second day with cheek marks still dark on the stock and set the rifle gently down, the way a man lays down a photograph when he's finished looking. He didn't say much, just raised 2 fingers by way of thanks. Moretti nodded once, then got busy checking screws, as if applause were a poor use of time. Back home, the armory became the place you went to if you wanted to get better at anything. A comms tech came in one afternoon with a cracked connector he'd been taping since last fall and left with a plan to run tests in reverse and listen for where the signal failed, rather than hunt the loudest fault. A vehicle NCO brought a small list of chronic squeaks and figured out with Moretti's help that they were hearing a failure signature that would be a breakdown in 6 weeks if they didn't attend to it now. The principle traveled respect the tool, find the missing energy smooth, is fast. It turned out hammers and carburetors and schedules all speak the same language if you learn to hear it. The biggest change stayed in Brooks. There's a way men carry themselves after a public lesson that sticks. Some curl around the bruise and get smaller. The lucky ones grow around it and become strong where the crack was. Brooks had the good fortune to be the second kind. He swept floors in the morning not because he had to, but because he wanted to know what the floor told his boots. He checked the inventory with care, not because someone would count after him, but because it mattered to him that the numbers matched the truth. When a cocky private put his mouth ahead of his hands and made a crack about a supply corporal's soft job. Brooks didn't bark him down. He walked him to the case, tapped the glass, and told him the story the way Whitaker would have if he'd been there. "You see that pin?" Brooks said, his voice low and even. "That crack you can't see is where the power went. That's what assumptions do. They take energy out of a system, and you don't even know it's gone until the thing fails when you need it. Don't be that crack." The private looked as if he'd been handed a map of a place he thought he already knew. He didn't say sorry. He didn't have to. He adjusted his stance at the bench and shifted his grip the way you do when you realize your hand has been wrong about something small and important for a long time. Once or twice, visiting dignitaries tried to turn Moretti into an exhibit. Whitaker ran interference with the smoke-dry skill of a man who had learned to say no without giving offense. He would walk the visitor past the case, allow the short, polite silence it demanded, and then deflect with logistics, schedules, supply chains, constraints, all true, all necessary, all as much as anyone needed. If the visitor had sense, they left with what mattered. If they didn't, they left with nothing and didn't know it. Months passed. The habits held. The armory began to feel like a chapel again, not because of anything religious, but because of the way people lowered their voices in the presence of an order they respected. Smooth is fast showed up in corners of the base where no pistol had ever been holstered. Assumptions are rust appeared on the whiteboard in the maintenance bay and on a post-it in the comms closet and in the corner of Whitaker's own notebook where he kept the 3 things he refused to forget. Listen more than you speak. Standards are contagious. The quiet ones are almost always worth asking first. Nobody forgot the day that had started the turn, but they stopped telling it as a miracle. They told it as a case study. A living veteran walked into a room that had forgotten what it owed to the work and reminded the room not with a lecture, but with a small, precise act of service. A missing energy was found and returned. A machine worked again. Men grew up a notch. That was enough. One afternoon, in late fall, as the light slid sideways through the high windows and turned the dust in the air to gold, Colonel James Whitaker came down from his office and stood at the entry case. He put his hands in his pockets in the universal posture of men who aren't sure whether to speak. Lana Moretti was at the bench checking action screws with the kind of attention that makes other people breathe quietly. "Chief Whitaker said I wanted to show you something." He pointed to a new card inside the case, a little tent of paper set at an angle between the loop and the bagged pin. The type was small and plain. "Respect the tool. Assumptions are rust." Seemed like it was time to put the doctrine in the window, Whitaker said. Moretti looked at the card for a long breath, then at the colonel, then back to the work. "It's not mine," she said. "It's the work telling you what it needs." Whitaker smiled like a man who has heard truth and doesn't want to spoil it by agreeing too loudly. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm keeping your phrasing." He left her to the bench. The armory moved on. The unit kept shooting better than its paper said it had any right to. The All-Army Championship added another year to the Bishop Trophy's story. A second loop showed up in the case after a training cycle where two different teams found two different microfailures before either became a big failure. Nobody wrote a memo about it. Nobody needed to. And if you asked Dylan Brooks to distill what he'd learned, he wouldn't give you a sermon. He'd hand you a rag and point you toward a tool and tell you to start where your hands are. He'd tell you that the longest distances in any shop are not between bench and shelf, but between pride and the willingness to be taught. He'd tell you that men get a lot done when they stop trying to be loud enough to be believed and start trying to be good enough not to need to be. If you pressed him, he might gesture toward Lana Moretti and say that the day she took a failed pin out of a rifle, she put a better one into him too. Most of all, he'd tell you quietly that a place is lucky when it has a standard. Luckier still when that standard is a person who doesn't need her name on a banner to keep the lights on in the dark. The rest you could figure out for yourself. It was in the way the door swung open, and the first thing you saw was a case with a trophy and a loop, and a small brass line that said more about what mattered than 100 briefings could. Competence requires no announcement. If you stood there long enough to say the words in your own head, and then went to a bench and picked up a tool and tried to make something right, then the story had done its work. And if you were the kind of person who had lived long enough to know that most of the world was louder than it needed to be, you felt the relief of a truth you could hold in your hands and hand down when it was your turn to set a standard. After all, in rooms like this, rooms full of steel and oil, and men trying to be worthy of the jobs they'd been given, the deepest rivers always made the least noise. And the best measure of a life was not what it demanded, but what it quietly improved and left better than it found.